We start today with Dan Wylie talking about unsustainable memory, ecology and paradox in Ruth Miller's poetry. Over to Dan.
Isn't it interesting how nothing is set up for the old-fashioned people who read off pieces of paper, you know? Nowhere to put anything, no light. I hope I can see what I'm doing here. Tom. Right, let's get down to some hardcore poetry here. Ah, that's better. Well done. Thank you. The powerful work of South African poet Ruth Miller, who died at the age of 50 in 1969, has enjoyed a small resurgence of interest in recent years, notably via three critics, Michael Chapman, Joan Metlerkamp, and Wendy Woodward. Wendy's focus has been prompted by a new animal studies thrust within eco-criticism, so she's particularly relevant to us today. Now, Woodward's readings of Ruth Miller's animal presences are, like Metlerkamp's and Chapman's readings, persuasive as far as they go, but I think all three are hobbled by their respective agendas. In brief, there seems to be an overriding desire to read the poems in more or less positive vein, whether in terms of craft, Michael, or feminist advancement, Joan, or anti-apartheid ethics, or most relevantly here, what Lionel Abrams, in his introduction to his now standard text of Miller's work, has called reverence for nature. All our critics have more or less unquestioningly followed this phrase or something like it, while only here and there on the side kind of thing acknowledging her tragic vision or her philosophical pessimism. I'll be suggesting here that the emphasis at least is wrong, that the positive bias comes at the cost of ignoring or underplaying the context of an enveloping philosophical stance of coruscating negativity, told you, Sam, of an ecosystem of perpetual danger, ever-imminent death, and ultimately cosmic annihilation. I'm offering in an unfashionable sort of way a reading of the poem's apparent worldview. I'm not trying to psychologize Miller as a person who may have done other things besides the poetry, but what the poems seem to offer is a kind of cumulative or not necessarily always coherent construction or fiction, and asking, what do we now do with that vision that the poems seem to offer? So I'll proceed via the following four main questions. Firstly, how present is the non-human world in Miller's oeuvre? To what degree can Miller's sensitivity to the non-human be deemed ecological or ecosystemic, as a question of definitions? Thirdly, how does this ecology then articulate with her near-nihilistic cosmo-philosophical stance? And fourthly, what is the role of remembering, a frequently used word in the poems, and by extension archiving, given such a vision? What ultimately these poems seem to ask is the point. So the first question is easily answered. Elements of the non-human world permeate the poetry, from land and seascape environments down to individualized creatures, fox, mantis, cats, kite, dog, penguin. Spiders, bees, leaves, trees, pebbles, rocks, and perhaps above all birds and more appear repeatedly, sometimes naturalistically, but seldom without additional symbolic or psychological implication. In short, there's more than enough material to justify an eco-critical reading. The second question, how ecological is Miller's depiction of the non-human, is trickier to answer. This obviously depends partly on one's definition of ecology and ecosystem. Does one insist on the narrowest scientific definition of ecology as the study of relations between organisms and their environment, classically excluding the human, kind of nature out there idea? Or do we go for a wider definition which includes human activity and impact and even human symbolic productions such as poems within the ecosystem? It's that old question of, are we part of nature or apart from nature? One is left to puzzle out some or other variant of what Donna Haraway has called nature culture, one word, right, that they integrated seamlessly. There's no single answer here. One can range, moreover, from a view of nature as incorrigibly a Darwinian struggle for existence, characterized primarily by violence and predation, through to some or other amelioration of that entangled bank, in Darwin's phrase, which includes beauty and pleasure, cooperation, symbioses, as equally efficacious drivers of evolutionary dynamics. So in what aspects might we see Miller as ecological? Firstly, she's closely observant of the natural. The anatomical detail of her famous poem Mantis is a good example. You may remember that poem with its flanged for flight body, its pod-shaped body, the green jagged legs and so on. But this in itself doesn't necessarily evince awareness of a functioning ecosystem of wider interrelations. Miller's sense of connection is more intuitive or personal, which is to say she extracts aspects and images which she imagines or experiences as fusing with or mirroring her own psyche. Mantis, again, is an explicit example of this, as their two triangular visages face off against each other. Secondly, then, it seems to make more sense to see Miller as expressing a Haraway-type nature culture in which human perceptiveness and expressiveness is projected as intimately interfused with natural elements. Lost my place. To give just one practical example, let's have a look at the poem Indigenous. This is one of only a couple of poems, and I mean like two, to take an unalloyed pleasure in natural phenomena, and is notable for its melding of topographical, animal, and psychological imagery. So here goes the poem. Low scrub rattles in the hot mouth of the wind. A hawk hovers on blue nothingness. Scorpion seeks the coolness where a snake unrolls its long, gnarled root beneath the indomitable shade of a grey wild fig, twisted, gaunt with age, with remembering before the wagons creak the scream of spears, before the spears the formidable silencers. Where shadowed water slides, the moss grows like an emerald pelt. The sun lies like a leopard down. Sleep-filled, the river moves in earthy caves. The roots are bitter, but bees in the furred pollen hum. Birds nest in dead trees. The rain, it seems, will come. At this point, the mood is tentative and ambivalent. The rain, it seems, will come. But then we get one final indented stanza of contrastively more positive tenor. Rain, when it falls, will lie softly on the grass. With the beneficent sky will green raise Lazarus. Doesn't seem to me to quite fit, as if the poet had belatedly said to herself, whoops, I better give that old romantic seasonal renewal motif a bit of a look in here. I said unalloyed pleasure, but that's not quite so, is it? There does seem to be a kind of evolutionary progression towards release or improvement, or at least seasonal renewal, pollen and greenness. But there is also the backdrop of nothingness and silence. There are the threats of aging and the signs of death. There is the misanthropic reference to human violence. We can also note in three further references which are important for the rest of the discussion. Firstly, the uncertain qualities of wind and of water that slides, favorite word, as if the whole world is somehow unstable. Secondly, the passing reference to remembering, to which we will return, and the use of the word green, green rays Lazarus. Given the ubiquity of this eco-friendly but politically loaded moniker these days, perhaps it's worth tracking its usage through the poems as a shorthand, if possibly anachronistic gauge of the ecological. How green is Miller? Certainly, Miller expresses green thoughts, echoing Andrew Marvell, no doubt, and once or twice, as in Indigenous, greenness does indicate seasonal renewal, but mostly the appearances are unpromising. Take these dipstick lines as representative. The blinding green hills of our sorrow, a green growl. Our green uncharted islands sink in ravelled floods, blind-eyed. Here there is no greening sedge to wither. Glance at Keats. Green things grow in the wrong places. To underline the point, we might take the poem Credo, a title that promises some sort of manifesto. It's actually on the facing page in Abraham's edition to Indigenous. So in place of the previous poem's imagery of Lazarus-like spring renewal and beneficent rain, here we have an environs of forbidding frost, pain, blindness, religion-induced self-recrimination, and utter lostness. And it includes the line, "Those who live in wilderness expect no rain." So it's first indication of that context of negativity that I was talking about. Now imagine, like most of us, Miller balanced these perspectives against one another all the time: hope against despair, love against loss, and so on. In this context, then, are those moments of succor and beauty, such as they are, more or less meaningful and important? More real precisely by virtue of their ephemerality, or merely illusory? A question to return to. In a third aspect, Miller might be termed ecological in a contemporary vein, one which has only gained increasing urgency in the intervening half-century: the catastrophic human impact on other animals. There are two prominent depictions: the famously oiled penguin on the beach, and a lesser-known play for voices, The Finches, which closely echoes Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, which was mentioned yesterday, in its warning about the environmental toxicity of mass poisons. These certainly evince compassion for the creatures killed or traumatized by modern industrialization, and hint that nature might have intrinsic value in a more depersonalized or deep ecology sense. A subset of this impulse towards caring is evidenced in other poems that are arguably empathically imaginative of a particular creature's point of view. This is Wendy Woodward's line. Again, she draws on Deleuze and Guattari, we met yesterday, their idea of becoming animal, getting into the kind of animal mentality in some way. And again, I can agree to a point with Wendy, but Miller's mood is typically unsentimental and seldom unalloyed by some other poetic, usually personal, symbolic purpose. An example where Wendy, bless her good horse Galahad, exaggerates the empathic element while taking insufficient account of the existential context is again Mantis. Mantis is a frightening poem. Wendy argues that Miller sees herself in the mantis and so becomes Mantis in a sense, but in fact it's a malicious, frightening meeting of horrors. Another is the ironically titled Sea Idyll, which is nothing of the sort, in which the poet encounters a blind dog lost on a beach and in the vicinity a dead seagull. Woodward valorizes the sympathetic way in which the riven poet becomes dog, entering the animal's consciousness. I think, okay, but Woodward then underplays the context of unrelieved lostness. The dog is not rescued or given any succor in the poem, and ever imminent death, from which there is no relief. So I've already begun, I guess, to answer question number 3. How does ecology and paradoxically caring for a natural ecosystem jibe with that broader view? Miller is no Mary Oliver. In virtually all examples, natural relations are depicted as, to echo Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short, and the human is as predatory and as vulnerable as any other animal. Time and again, Miller depicts unfeeling predation as nature's norm. The cat or the eagle takes the mouse, the kites compete with the lion, the bird takes yet another worm, the spider eats her mate. I can find no example of mutualism or symbiosis in her representations of the natural world. She says, the inanimate alone shows charity, which is no charity at all. This dark ecosystem, which is both externally objective and psychically internal, a private forest, she calls it, pointing towards ultimately entropic dissolution. So do such instances of recognition, tenderness, and empathy as we find amount to reverence, as Abrahams and his acolytes repeat. If we take the common view of reverence for nature to mean that nature provides a quasi-spiritual substitute for a manifestly absent God, the poem's answer would appear to be a gravely disappointing no, very unlike Mbali's and others' presentations yesterday. This is a very hard-eyed vision, a voice that is profoundly not at peace with nature. To briefly reinforce this, some representative quotations. The poem Come Not Unto Me is prefaced by an epigraph from Faustus, for nothing can rescue me. One of her best-known poems, The Floating Island, reads, wrenched from our continent we blunder, and lacking weather sense for guide, our green uncharted islands sink in ravelled floods, blind-eyed. From song, what shall we do with the time that has passed? Wind it and grind it, and when we are dead, set it for headstone on every man's head. Most dismissive of all, perhaps, nothing can be uttered. Nothing matters. Miller's repetition. So finally, given this apocalyptic overview of what value is remembering, remembrance, archiving, heritage, the words remember and memory recur in numerous poems. At times this involves recall of a more innocent childhood scene, elegiac even as it subsides into adult pessimism. Here's another thematic sampling, which again is unpromising, or rather uncompromising. The trees remember birds only because their nests fly apart in the wind. The scene in After the Fire offers only our joint memory of horror. The Long Journey appears a paradoxical effacement as memory tries to forget the tonnage of the hill. A wonderful phrase, the tonnage of the hill. But memory tries to forget. Interesting. The poem Silent the Singer sums up, we cannot hold anything for long. Even memory, perhaps especially memory, is unsustainable. From a key poem here titled, Remember, Remember, the spinning night, darker than ever, closes in. Feeling cheerful yet? To close in on our conference theme then, a few poems take a look at archivists and archiving of various kinds, seeming only to reinforce the hopelessness of memorialization. Sterkfontein, another oft anthologized poem, exploring the discovery of prehistoric human remains, does not revel in paleontological cleverness, African belonging, and related excitements, only on the glum observation that in the end, humans of whatever era have in common only the kingdom of shared graves. Especially relevant to the present venue, she touches on museums. A deceased blind man's rooms seem to the poet to be a museum, filled with clutter fit to choke you. In War Museum, a wife feels similarly suffocated by her husband's absorption in wartime memories. So if memory is so fragile, even meaningless, what is the point of the archivist? What is the point of you, Tom? Given the enveloping oblivion and silence, is archiving the words of the now deceased of greater or lesser value? Ironically, the poems suggest that the very material of their own being, words, are as ephemeral as anything. In Spider, she writes of the poor cold corpse of words. In Fox, wind and water have few words. It's significant that these sentiments arise especially in connection with non-human creatures. More for me to explore, I think, there. There are many, many more examples, but it's apposite to end with the poem entitled Words. And here's the poem. Some words tie, bind, ravel as air on air, which means they don't tie at all, right? It's full of these paradoxes. Oh yeah, I had paradox in my title, didn't I? I thought I'd get there eventually. Some words tie, bind, ravel as air on air, untroubled by the invincible passage from meaning to message. But from message to the meaning, there is no way of learning the word that should be sounded exactly as intended. The heart then to such dullards remains the only tutor. The meaning becomes valid in the brainless future, which is to say, of no validity at all. The paradox here, of course, is that Miller continued to write poems, even each one a small monument to its own dissolution, or a stay against the void, even as it records its ephemerality. Why she continued to write at all is a psychological issue beyond our scope here. We can respond to the poem's nihilism in a number of ways. We can accept it as valid, we can ignore it as deluded, we can deplore its articulation through extraordinary poetry, and it is wonderful poetry, censor it out of our archives and consciousness altogether, and soldier on, or we can wield it as a powerful, even necessary counterpoint to the temporary, fragile, yet miraculous emergence of life on earth. I must leave it to your own heart, which, as he says, remains the only tutor. Thank you.
Our next presentation is Ayanda, Mncwabe-Mama, Nursing the Rattling Bones. Thanks, Ayanda.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much to the Amazwi Museum for organizing this wonderful conference. And also thank you so much to the people out there who have taken time out to actually be with us today and to actually tune in as well on social media. Today my presentation is titled Nursing the Rattling Bones. And it is my small attempt at looking at the role that archaeology can actually play in our healing as a nation, but also maybe as a continent on a whole. But when I say rattling bones, I do know that KwaXhosa, whenever they are connecting to the ancestors, the first line that they start with is siyaqamagusha kumanyanga lelukthula, siyaqamagusha kumathambo amhlophe. So the bone, that is when they're evoking or they're saying that the bone, they're trying to connect with the bone that is resting peacefully. But in this instance, I'm saying rattling bones. So I'm not sure why it's not showing. Okay, it's showing. So I use rattling bones as a word that is unstable, unease, and ignored. And when I say ignored, I'm talking about the ancestors. So that is what I would like to maybe explore in this presentation. My presentation, I will start with defining some of the terms that I will be using and go through what motivated my idea, and also look at the common narrative, because today what I wanted to look at was our connection with Abatwa or Nokagantu. And we look at the African perspective on nature and spirituality and see how archaeology can still play a role in all of this that is going to be said today. And then I'll go to my conclusion. The terminology, as we all know, archaeology deals with material culture. So most of the things that we deal with, we study history, but looking at the tangibles most of the time. We look at things that one can touch, one can see. But Sonia Atelay's definition of indigenous archaeology that I would like to focus on today, it says that it's research that critiques and deconstructs Western archaeological practice while working towards recovering and investigating indigenous practices and traditional knowledge systems. And I would also like to move away today, maybe not using the word Khoisan, which was coined by Schultz in 1926. And for today, I would like to use the word Abatwa or Nokagantu. And for me, it comes from our oral history and our oral tradition that we are part of the Bantu group. And Abantu, not in the colonial Bantu group sense, but also not in that loose translation of humans, Abantu. So Abantu for me, it means we are the children of Ntu, who is our common ancestor. And that is why I'll use Abatwa or Nokagantu, referring to the Khoisan. And my research idea, or the idea that I have to research, I've worked a lot with traditional healers as a documentary filmmaker. I spent over 15, 18 years following them around, capturing their rituals and looking at what they do and how they conduct also the rituals and the meaning behind all the rituals that we are meant to do as Abantu, Abantundu as well, as Africans. And one of the main things is that we have challenges accessing some of the sacred spaces whenever they want to do their rituals, especially like in the Drakensberg areas or nature reserves. And once I also started thinking about archaeology maybe as a way or as another discipline that I can add to my skills, it was mainly because of the technical tools that they use for excavation, but also how they go about finding out some of the truths that they give to us as a public, but also informing policy and the legislature, because I think that is very important, especially when we're working with Indigenous people. So that is the main reason why I'm interested in archaeology and as a student of archaeology as well. And I discovered that when I was doing my research last year, when I was looking for rock art sites for my research, I would come across Abenguni. When I say Abenguni, it could be Amaxhosa, Amahlubi, and other nations who would be going to the shelters to do certain rituals, whether it was initiation rituals, but also they'll be doing family-initiated rituals. And they could be doing it on the side of the shelter, or they will also come into the shelter and do these rituals. And every time I would ask, they would tell me about their dreams, that they were sent to this place and they've never seen it before, but only in their dreams. So that is what I would like to explore as well today, the connection that we might be sharing as a people. This is one of the sites that I went to, Eqhinzi. And when I arrived there, contrary to a lot of belief, people actually value rock art as much as us as scientists believe that we are vandalizing, we do not care about these sites. The elders in the community told me that they don't allow the kids to go into that site. Even the people that come to this site, most of them, as you can see, I think the river is drying, but the people come to do their rituals, they actually use the site, they don't go inside the shelter itself. And this other site, which was my main site for my research, is in St. Mark's, Ekofimvaba. And also, this is one of the sites I found some beads in the shelter. And I know when I asked my supervisor if I could record it on my sheet for my report, she was like, no, maybe don't record it because it might be problematic when people want to go to the site and they won't be allowed to go into the site because of the laws that we have in this country. So this was St. Mark's. And where I stay in my village, Mncwabe James at Debenek, this was when I started looking and I asked my neighbors to show me some of the caves and some of the shelters that are around. We found this one, but they said, no, we just use this one as for our initiation when the boys go through the initiation rites. So it wasn't, there's no paintings in the site. But it's strange because a few months later, I met an old woman who I just gave a lift when I was coming from one of the sites, and she told me that she had a dream and she's going to my village. And I just started asking her where and everything. She's like, no, I'm going to this cave and it's like there. So she explained it and it was exactly the same site. And for me, when I asked her about her lineage, she is Ukhatebe, Bupungane, so those are part of the Hlubi nations. So I'll come back to that as well, what I'm trying to connect. And I want to talk about the common narrative. We're always told that there is 1,000 san left in this province. There is 500 koi left in this because they are extinct. And when I was reading or going through some of the Believing and Seeing that was written by Lewis Williams, he says it is impossible to decipher the cosmology found in rock art because the san are extinct. since the late 19th century. So that is what Lewis Williams says. And also, we all know it is very sad in our history that we do need to talk about the genocide. The genocide which happened in the 1800s, I mean, when the Cape Colony was also expanding, but also in Namibia, we look at that, what the Germans also did, and we need to take ownership of such events. And human beings were hunted as sport, and this has caused generational trauma. And this also caused a lot of people or lot of nations to actually hide their identity and to be assimilated in some. So for example, I would use this Uduma. Duma clan is found in the northern KZN. And they had Inkosi Dumisa, who is the one who was also protecting and taking Abato under his wing every time they were being attacked. Also, it's similar to Nkosi Chungwa around the 1700s, who was also working with David Stearman to actually protect Onokagangwe as well during the frontier wars. And this led to intermarriages, and it led to lifelong relations as well. And for me, this is the main reason why I'm presenting today, that we have to look beyond what we see and actually go down on the ground and learn to listen to even people, because in archaeology we have this thing that there are no people, these people are not the ancestors of the current generation. But when you speak to Amaxhosa or when you speak to healers in certain areas, they might not be able to give you the answers you need on the normal, but when they go into a trance, when you engage with them further as well, there is some knowledge that we can learn from healers in our society. And some of the main issues that I wanted to raise, that we have permit issues. I think with the preservation of heritage and locking up natural resources, now we're having a problem of gaining access to ancestral land, and so indigenous people are being excluded from those spaces. And then we also need permission from farm owners. So if they say, no, I mean, it's my land, you cannot come into my space, then it robs us as well of our spiritual, of our spiritual healing as well as a people. And also we are governed or regulated by the NARA, which is the National Heritage Resources Act, number 25 of 99. But when you look at it, especially section 35, which talks about archaeology, paleontology, and meteorites, and how heritage should be managed, there are problems because it actually clashes with some of the beliefs of the indigenous people. So we need to relook at that. And one of the instances, I think it was written by Unduguyake Undlovu, who speaks about the ritual, the annual ritual that the Duma clan actually does take, and they go up the mountain. And through AMAFA, which is the heritage agency in KZN, they have those restrictions. You have 8 to 10 people in a shelter at a time, and they tell them that you cannot make the dust rise. Every time you're there, you need to be careful, don't rub against the walls. And we need to remember that art in Africa is not art for art's sake. Art serves a function. And for us, that is one of the things we need to remember, but also be respectful that by us singing and clapping ingoma, song is umuti. It's medicine. It's a way of us invoking the ancestors for their healing, but also for our healing as well as a people. And it's sad that, I mean, we are so preoccupied as archaeologists in the tangibles, but we need to understand that the tangibles, they wouldn't be valuable to us if it wasn't for the intangible value as well. So they are there, and we strip them off of that essence. And that is why you find vandalism as well in those spaces, because people then cannot relate and cannot connect any longer with those spaces. And this is what David Mahlamela also says. It's unfortunate that Western science struggles with the phenomena of spirituality, as it cannot be verified using their tools. That is why Africa's ontological perspectives, our ways of knowing, are sometimes dismissed as fairy tales or delusions. And there's also examples of Badimong. I think in the eastern part of Free State, there's the Badimong and Motuleng sacred caves. And for them, they say that Abato paintings are regarded as sacred messages that have spiritual power. So they still have people coming from all over the place, going there and for their healing rituals. Now, how archaeology can play a role. Sorry, I think I'm stuck. Archaeology can play a role as it needs to give power. I didn't say empower, but to give back the power to indigenous communities. And that is allowing indigenous communities to share with you what were the indigenous ways of preserving certain spaces. And if we want to know, we would actually spend time and incorporate that into our research. And we need to learn about prehistoric or indigenous preservation methods. And also, we move away from that thinking that Western science is superior to any other science. We need to be able to incorporate all those ways of knowing because they are all valuable to us as a global village. And we need to respect African spiritual philosophies as well, and remember that within those natural resources, mountains, rivers, oceans, and even caves, they are regarded as sacred spaces, and we have different ancestors that reside in those different spaces. And in conclusion, the rattling bones will not stop until we learn to respect each other as humans and not just as research subjects, and locked away in dark boxes of museums displayed for tourism purposes. And I will not take away from individuals who are making strides. There was also a case, I think it was 2017, UCT, one of the researchers who actually found a box which was written and with some bones, and actually made it a point that she goes back to Sutherland and finds the family. And that closure, it's healing as well for the family, but it's healing for the whole community because we have all this injustice that has been done. So us as individuals as well in our disciplines, we can do much more. So the bones do speak and they carry our DNA and our traumas and wisdom of our past. To heal, we must balance those below and those above ground. And colonial disciplines such as the archaeology, we can do more. We are not just handmaidens for other disciplines as well, but maybe we should adopt the stance of Nancy Hughes Skippers, where she suggests that we should just be barefoot archaeologists instead of high-heeled archaeologists. So that is us also working into looking at the ground and working with people on the ground. And I would like to leave you with these words by one of the philosophers that I like to read now and then. And those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music. So we need to think about that. As a people, our healing depends on us listening to each other and working together as well. So, and Amako, thank you so much for your time.
The next speaker is David Walwyn, Changing Narratives on Rock Art and Exploring New Pedagogies in, chopped off bit on my paper, Eco-Decolonial Practice in Environmental Education. Just want to note to David, please watch the chat for your timing in this session. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Anthea, and just let me check that everyone can hear me and see me at this point.
We can hear and see you. Are you sharing?
Hi, David. Yes, we can. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so here we are on a roll. I am David Walwyn, as Anthea outlined, and Anthea mentioned, and I'm going to be talking about this question, the question of changing narratives on rock art and exploring new pedagogies in achieving eco-decolonial practice in environmental education. I have to say that I work in sustainability transitions, and I mean, so we all work in sustainability transitions to a greater or less extent, but generally I am talking to a conference which involves political scientists and economists and science and technology policy people. So this is quite an unusual gathering for me to be addressing, but not at all unwelcome, if you like, or it's a great pleasure to be here and listening to the other talks and to learn a lot about the way in which literary scholars and archaeologists and social anthropologists how they engage in this very important subject of sustainability transitions. So there are two threads that I want to pick up on that are common to my presentation and that I've heard a lot about in other presentations. And the first thread is this question of changing hearts and minds. So in the very first plenary talk that was given by Joan McGregor, in which she talked about changing hearts and minds, and I remember this is one particular quote from her, and it says, "I want to make an impression on minds not yet hardened by cynicism." So this question of get them young. So if we want to change hearts and minds, and particularly in respect of sustainability transitions, we need to talk to the young people, so that the future generations. And she said, some of these readers may become ambassadors of change and as a result make our future cleaner, greener, and more sustainable. So that's the one thread, the thread of changing hearts and minds. And I particularly I work in a university and I have a cohort of university students who are adults. They are part-time students. They are in their 20s and 30s. And so I would not put them in the category of formative minds. They have already made up their minds from an ontological and epistemological perspective. And so it's a much more challenging task to get them to change how they think about the world. And so that's the one thread. And the second thread is the one that Tom raised, and that in a way goes back to the title of my talk, and the title about eco-decolonial practice. And so Tom raised this issue about the binary between humans and nature. So that dualism, and he noted that violent dualisms persist under the neoliberal framework. And so the eco-decolonial is focused on remaking this dualism in terms of an integrated perspective. And it's particularly that aspect which I am going to refer to as nature connectedness that I'm going to come back to. Now, in the kind of progression of these two threads, I'm going to use the idea of Theriantropes. And so let me just start sharing my screen at this point. So I'll share that, and hopefully I can get this in presentation mode. So just bear with me. Oh, that's not what I want. I've got to move this out of the way so I can see it slideshow from the beginning. So just let me check with everyone, or we'll check with you. You can see the slide, presumably, changing narratives on rock art.
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Yes,
brilliant.
we can.
All right, so in exploring this issue about how you change ontologies, I started to question the way in which these ideological assemblages influence how people view evidence. And so I'm going to talk about Theriantropes, first of all, in the context of how they can be used to illustrate this very important relationship between the way in which people make the progression. And I think yesterday there was a very interesting talk about a linear progression from information to knowledge to worldview to climate action. And so here's just a simple example, and I'm going to talk about Bushman in this presentation. I know that there's lots of controversy around how one might talk about Bushman, whether it's Khoisan or San. And in the previous speaker, Ayanda gave me a new term, which I would love to use, but I can't remember what it is right now. So here's just a quote in which it's a discussion about Bushman language, and it says the language is isolating one, the words consisting of clicks, snores, and warbles in the throat, originating probably from time before the human tongue acquired the nicer adjustments necessary for articulation. And you can see the racism in that particular quote. So here is the picture of the Theriantropes that I'm going to be talking about. What is a Theriantrope? Well, it's a mythical being which is part human, part animal. And the actual concept of theriantropy refers to the fantastical or the mythological ability of humans to change into animals. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you will see those four figures, which are the classic Theriantropes. These figures are depicted in a painting which is on the farm Schaapplaats. It's one of 10 national monuments for Bushman paintings, and it's located in the area here, which is shown here, which is in the Golden Gate area. It has a particular personal relevance to me because this farm, the farm scarp plots, was actually owned by my parents for over a 45-year period. It's no longer in the family. And I used to regularly walk past these paintings and wonder what they meant. And just to note to Ayanda and this issue about access to paintings, these are public paintings and anyone can access them at any time. And as the owner of that property, I don't remember ever turning anyone away or my parents turning anyone away from coming to see them. They are a fantastic exhibition of Theriantrope and really worth the visit. So what are the interpretations of these? And I've come across all four in the course of the years that I lived or visited this farm. And so the four were shown here, just very briefly, and I'm going to them in a little bit more detail. So the instrumentalist interpretation with that these are hunters wearing masks, and then the under the influence, what I'm going to call under the influence interpretation, which is shaman visualizations whilst in a trance. And then the beginning to move into the David Lewis Williams interpretation about spiritual storehouses and reservoirs of potency, so that this was some form of communication between the artist and the spiritual world, and then finally spiritual depictions themselves. So these are actually much the same ways one might find depictions of God or Christ in a Christian church, that these are spiritual depictions and represent a particular image, if you like, or version of God. So in the mask hunters, this is the instrumentalist. Here's just a quote that illustrates that perfectly. So this is from 1909. And interestingly, these four interpretations really do represent some kind of chronology. So there's been a progression, if you like, of the chronology. The wearing of the heads of antelopes may have been mere hunters' disguises calculated to delude the game and render approach more easy. So you can see that they're very clear in terms of what these paintings were about. So they were just instrumentalist depictions which illustrated the way in which these societies undertook their hunter-gatherer activities. Then there was the second one, this is 1933 by someone called Bleek, and Beliefs and Customs in the Bushman. And when they did rain dances, they would go into a trance to capture one of these animals, as depicted in the rock art, the rain dance. Animals they saw resemble the hippopotamus or an antelope. So this is what happens if you imbibe too much psychedelic substances and you go into a trance. This is the kind of things that you see. You would see, for instance, half human, half animals, and in this particular case, humans wearing the heads of antelopes. And then moving now much more recently, and this is Sven Usman in his interpretation of exactly this rock art site that I've referred to. And the important point here is this issue about the transformation, so that this transformation is part of a belief that certain animals contained a supernatural essence, and that this supernatural essence could be accessed, if you like, through the medium of the painting. And so in order to use this potency, the potency of different animals and their spiritual potency, shamans had to become one with the animal. And then finally, David Lewis Williams in the book Reservoirs of Potency, and the previous speaker actually alluded to some of his other work in the interpretation of these. The paintings are depictions of the spiritual world. So I'm going to use the term animism here, and animism is in a way a subset of pantheism. So it's the belief that God is in all things, and in animism, the belief that God is in particularly living creatures. And that the rock face was then this veil between the world and between the world as we know it, the world of as we see it and experience it, and the spiritual world. And so it was a way of accessing the spiritual world, much like a stained glass window that you would recognize from churches and other religious buildings. And that as a consequence, the term reservoirs of potency, which is one of David Lewis Williams's terms, And it simply refers to this ability to, through the rock art, to access the reservoirs of potency that are held by different animal beings. So let me just, I'm going to change tack a little bit at this point. So just have in your minds this issue about the interpretation of rock art, and particularly the importance of rock art, the recognized importance of rock art right now in terms of its depiction of the spiritual world and the way in which that spiritual world can be brought into everyday life. So I was interested in this relationship between, if you like, evidence or information and the way in which we then constitute knowledge or set up epistemological systems. And started to work a bit on that in that field. And here's a reference from 2017 in which I looked at the influence of epistemology on research methodology. So the question here was, what kind of decisions do we take in undertaking a particular piece of research, and how is that influenced by personal epistemologies? And there is an interesting discussion in this about the preconceptions of particularly master students in engineering, and what kinds of relevant approaches should be taken in their view in exploring a particular research question. So I, as a consequence of this work, developed this framework, and this is a theoretical framework, and it basically refers in a way to that interaction, which was Joanne McGregor referred to in the beginning. She talked about this issue of drip feeding a message to, I just need to be sure, I must keep an eye on my chat, 10 minutes left. Hopefully that's still applicable. So that this question of how do you, in a discursive forum, how do you influence students of a particular cohort? So this is a diagram. On the top is the role, if you like, of the facilitator or the creative artist or the lecturer in this particular case. So you have a background ideational ability, your foreground discursive ability, which is the ability to communicate ideas and persuade a particular cohort. And then the cohort themselves, they come into a lecture with a background ideology, which I've called an ideological assemblage. But on top of that, there is a foreground cognitive flexibility or a discursive flexibility, which might be the opposite of discursive fixation. And as a consequence of the interaction between those two, there's a communication, and then there may be some form of deep learning and what I've called naturing. So naturing is the issue of nature connectedness. And essentially what the whole point is of this interaction is to increase the level of nature connectedness of that particular cohort. So I've also used this term liminality, which is the issue about emerging identity. So to what extent is it possible as a consequence of a discursive interaction to bring a student from their present perspectives into a liminal state? And that liminal state would be described by the state of being on the threshold. So effective and persuasive teaching can lead to an emergent identity. And that's basically the argument that I used in the development of a particular intervention. So in the last part of this, I'm going to talk about the intervention, and I'm going to talk about it on the basis of Judith Butler's notions about identity and cultural norms. So I must at this point clarify that in the whole structure agency debate, and I know that the two should not and cannot be separated, that there is a recursive relationship between structure and agency, that I fall particularly on the structural side, and I do so as a consequence of the work done by Judith Butler and other feminists. And let me see, there's a chat message, 5 minutes left, okay? So we'll make that. So, Judith Butler's individuals act in accordance with cultural norms. So there's the structural aspect, and identity is a construct which is established through the stylized repetition of acts. So identity is not just something that you think about, identity is something that you construct as a consequence of doing. And that's a very, very fundamental point in this whole discussion about naturing and nature connectedness. So in the same way that gendering refers to the process of socialization, nature connectedness refers to a process of socialization, which leads to the development of a specific relationship with the environment and with other people. And so my task, in a way, in the intervention with this student cohort that I was teaching was to try and understand whether my interventions might create a closer relationship for them between themselves and nature. So reduce that nature binary that Tom talked about on the first day yesterday. So what I did is I had an interactive session in which I showed the students some material, and then I questioned them before and after about their levels of nature connectedness. And I used a qualitative approach in understanding the results of the intervention, and I employed the techniques of interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is what IPA stands for. And the conclusions of that work were quite interesting. First of all, that this was a virtual platform that I used, that they are virtual platforms can be effective in creating debate and discussion, but they don't have any impact on ideological assemblages. It's very, very hard in a virtual platform to change the way in which people think about the world and the ways of knowing. And there was no particular common understanding in this group about karma and the concepts of nature connectedness. And finally, the students didn't feel threatened by the intervention. So in the very last section, I'm going to go back to Theriantropes, and I'm going to talk about this issue of nature connectedness. So typically when environmental psychologists and educationists explore this issue of the binary between self and nature, they use this diagram and they ask the respondent to locate themselves somewhere on the diagram. So on the bottom left, you would be completely, in a way, there's no separation between yourself and nature. Nature and your identity are merged. Whereas obviously on the top left here, this is a classical dualism in the way that we have been brought to understand the evolution of binary thinking in terms of nature and self. And so I started to think a little about whether one's interpretation of these Theriantropes could be the consequence or could be linked to this issue of nature connectedness. So could, for instance, where you locate yourself on this diagram influence what kind of interpretation you might ascribe to these paintings? And particularly on, if we think of that functionalist approach, to me, that would be an approach which is right on the top left on that diagram. In other words, it's this complete separation between nature and self, and that the whole purpose of the diagram is just to depict the way in which humans exploit their natural environment in the form of hunting and harvesting of resources. But on the bottom left, on the bottom right, I would put animism and pantheism, in the sense that there is this completely, there is no separation. There's this completely integrated relationship. The sense of well-being is completely connected to the way in which you feel connected to nature and your natural environment. And so the idea was simply that Theriantropes could be used as a way of understanding in a depiction other than those overlapping circles about the levels of nature connectedness. And I think that it really brings me to the end of my talk then. Is a discussion about one's understanding of the painting perhaps a starting point for raising awareness of alternative ontologies and changing one's relationship with nature? And I have tried initially to get students to write down, and I'd hoped to do that in this forum, but there really isn't enough time, to get you to write down how you would interpret this and where that might link to your sense of nature connectedness. So finally then, there is a need a global diagram of what works and what doesn't work in the virtual classroom, especially for environmental education. I find the concept of nurturing very useful. Has this session led to any liminality or emergent understanding? That would be a question. And finally, this question, if there's done nothing else, at least I've introduced you to a portmanteau of language And there we go back to Golden Gate. So thank you ever so much. And I will now stop sharing and get back to you.
Thank you, David. So I think we've got about 20 minutes for questions. Is that correct? Yeah. We start with questions from the audience present and then take questions online. Mncwabe, you're doing that? Okay, right. So just indicate to me if there's something. Would anybody like to start us off with a question? It's hard to see because these lights are very bright. Thanks.
On the last presenter, on the issue of Theriantrope, yeah. I was wondering if somehow there is some kind of downplaying as far as the interpretation of the concept is concerned. Because if I get it right, the projection is that the people concerned were just masking themselves with animal skins for hunting, which is fine. But I think I would like to think that there is another level where there is the actual transformation of humans to animal forms. Is there not that possibility? Did that not happen? I'm talking from the perspective of a healer or sangoma, where such magics happen.
David?
So if I mean, just briefly answering that question, there are different interpretations of the Theriantropes. And obviously the one interpretation, as I indicated, which I think is a very outdated interpretation now, was the functionalist one, in which these were just hunters who were camouflaging themselves in the skins of animals so that they could hunt their prey. And I mean, I don't think there would be anyone in this room or anyone that I would know who would say that that is the correct interpretation. I think we kind of moved on from that. And I think we've moved on in the sense of a greater understanding and appreciation of that particular relationship between these indigenous people and nature. And so if I understand you correctly, what you are proposing is that are the paintings actually not a depiction of people transforming themselves into animals in a physical way? And I mean, I think that's, you know, I've never witnessed that, and I don't think anyone else in the room has ever witnessed that. And I think we're talking figuratively here, so it's not in a real way. It's not. It's in a figurative sense, and I think that that's exactly the question we need to be asking. So, is there a way of knowing which was evident to this particular group of indigenous people, which resulted in a belief that figuratively it would be possible for humans to become one with animals? And that's the belief of animism. So at this point, we have to consider it as a belief, in the same as we may have a belief in monotheism or pantheism or polytheism. Animism is an aspect of that. And I guess the hypothesis that I'm saying is that if we are to believe in anything, animism and pantheism hold the greatest chance for us of re-establishing our relationship with nature, and as a consequence of having an agency-directed sustainability transition, which is what we all desperately need, and what other people have already indicated in this conference. So I'm skirting your issue a little bit. Personally, if you're asking me, I don't think that's physically possible for humans to transform into animals, and that's, you know, that's because I've never seen it or never heard a reliable account of that. But I think figuratively, we need to be thinking about that a lot more deeply and what that means from a spiritual perspective.
Okay, there's a question over here. I think Dominique.
I'll just shout. Okay, thank you for all the papers. I'm really struck by the different possibilities offered by Ayanda's paper and David's paper in terms of the kinds of reality we might see as being real. In particular, Ayanda's referencing of dreams as a place in which those who interact with contemporary rock art sites are directed to attend those sites, and also as spaces where indeed people become animals. And that is no less of a physical realm in many epistemological traditions around the world than the material realm, which I think David is perhaps still very attached to. So I wondered actually about the dreams of David and Ayanda and how they may have influenced their coming to know in relation to their interest in rock art sites.
Would Ayanda like to take that question? Ayanda needs a mic.
In my understanding, I think dreams, it's a reality. The way that we've been taught, you travel to those spaces, you see those things. And I think when I'm trying to think of the question or Ubuti that was asking as well, in terms of the transformation, you become those, you know, when we, especially when we're talking about ancestors, you are not possessed, but you are them. You are them. So when, even with the animals, I know with the masks that we often talk about as well, they put them on, but they become that animal, or they become that, so because you behave as well that way. So my understanding is that the dreams are a reality. It's just in another time and you in another frame. So I'm not sure if maybe that answers anything, but yeah.
Okay, I did have a hand here first. So I want to come across to this man and then go back to you. In the meantime, perhaps David, shortly, do you want to comment a little on what's been asked from Dominique?
On the issue of dreams?
Yes, about dreams.
Okay.
Do you have anything to say?
So I guess in my worldview I guess in my worldview that the thing about dreams is that these are aspects of the self. And so you have to really explore what the image means to you. I mean, I've certainly had dreams about animals and where I have become, if you like, in the mind of an animal, but I then explore that in a completely different sense. So it's not in the sense of understanding my relationship, if you like, with nature, or whether I ascribe a spiritual entity, if you like, to a particular animal form. So, I mean, I'm not going to be able to answer this question in the 2 minutes that's available, because it's a very complicated discussion about how one views dreams within one's psychological views on the world. Yeah, I'm going to bypass that, but that's as far as I can go.
Yeah, but I think the very conversation we're having is about who one is, one's ontology and epistemology, and how one comes to these things. So if those of us who are white and Western are asked these questions, we come to it already embedded. That's exactly what people have been talking about in this very thing, is that there is an inescapable relationship with oneself here, and that self is not a loose, free-forming self. It's a self already embedded in something. So these questions are very hard. They're very, you know, your point about a liminality. Where is the point at which we can cross these boundaries into these other worlds? I think is really important at the moment. We've got to recognize that these are worlds meeting each other. So I don't
absolutely. I mean, just to say to that, though, that it's not just a race thing, you know, it's not just, you know, black people think about animals or dreams in a particular way and white people think. And in this work that I do with my students, it's not along race lines at all. So ontologies and what I call ideological assemblages are constituted in such different ways. Race is certainly a determinant, but it's by no means the only determinant. It's often to do with class, it's often to do with identity and context. So yeah, this is a complex way in which these ideological perspectives, or what we call ontological worldviews, how they are assembled.
Yeah, I want to go to this man over here who's been waiting patiently.
No, thank you so much, David and Ayanda. And I think David has already preempted what I wanted to ask. Just to congratulate the two of you, in particular Ayanda, for being courageous and begin to talk about issues that can actually transform the practice of archaeology, not just in South Africa, but on the continent. Because, for example, the issue of the dreams that they're talking about, there are diverse meanings and interpretations, and these have to be actually contextualized in the cosmological dimensions of a particular society. So which means you cannot be courageous enough to offer alternative interpretation without understanding the cultural practices of the people that you are dealing with. Because let's say there's a dream of a cave, that interpretation is informed by their understanding of what a cave means in their own perspective. And of course, I would like to encourage you, Ayanda, to look at something that is quite interesting, because you are looking at archaeology and what other values are being placed at these shelters now. So there's a timeline issue here, okay? Thousands, if not a long period. So you have to think about connecting practices where there's authorized discourse on what should be interpreted at rock art sites, but there are local values which are actually important to the communities, to the extent that you don't need the law to protect the sites. Once you recognize those local outstanding universal values, it becomes a protection mechanism, because they protect what they love. They protect what makes sense to their well-being as a society. So look at that, because I'm interested, of course we'll talk outside this process. If you look at church or missionary stations established in many countries, you will discover that they are juxtaposed to sacred landscapes in many countries. Just do a simple mapping, you will see. So what is that? So there's a connecting practice that is actually attracting all these layered values through time and space. So thank you for being courageous. I'm really encouraged that there's such a research, because I'm also an archaeologist. So we'll talk outside this meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I just want to check, Mncwabe, any questions from online that we should address? Not. Okay. Was there? And there's one there, of course. Thank you for reminding me.
It's not necessarily a question, but a comment, something that comes. Maybe the speakers can comment on it. This relationship between human beings and animals, and the dreams, of course, and then the other aspects about clan names. And often in every set of clans you'll find there's one, there will be an animal there. For instance, I'm from the Nyati clan. Nyati the buffalo, somebody from the Baboon clan, Omfene, somebody in the Vundla, and so on and so forth. So maybe David and Ayanda can share something about that.
Over to Ayanda.
I think for me, I think it's proof that us as Africans, we've never been separate from nature in the way that we actually respect nature, because if you nyati, then you know that you will not eat inyati or the buffalo meat, or if ungwenya, you will not eat the crocodile meat, or, you know, so there are totems as well that we connect to, and that actually helps us, you know, in terms of reminding us that we are nature, you know, so we are one with nature. So for us, that is why I'm saying that with archaeology, with these disciplines, we need to remember that this is the knowledge that we hold and that we have, whether it's a matter of us trying to help other people remember as well, but we've always known it. So recycling and all these new words and sexy terms that we're coming up with now, we've always known it. So it's just a matter of us remembering, maybe.
Okay, thanks, Ayanda. I want to draw Dan Wylie into this conversation. Yeah, can I draw Dan Wylie in? Because I think, no, I'd very much like to hear from you, Dan, because your poet, you know, was doing some shamanistic, animistic things there. So I do want to hear from you. What do you think in response to this conversation and with your poet? So let's take that question up there, seeing I've pounced it on you. Give you a moment to think and take the question up there and then ask you.
Thank you very much, Ayanda. Mine is very brief, to commend you and say that I'm very curious about the subject of transforming archaeology with practical examples from Mncwabe, where recently archaeologists ran to see the bones of the Umtwa that were in a village there, and how the role of the traditional leadership in terms of being instrumental in advocating for an understanding of archaeology by the local communities, instead of being a subject of the white monopoly, if I can label it that, because people think immediately there is archaeology. They won't trust the local chief, they will label and think that it is not a subject that can be very interesting and enticing and historically, spiritually motivating for connectedness in the village as a story for the children and as a legacy. So for me to say that you also exploring Mncwabe is very interesting for me. I think you've got a lot more to offer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so as you come down to Dan, here in the front, I also want to say thank you to Ayanda for the new language, because I do think, you know, when you read that quote, that early quote about, you know, Khoi language, San language that was heard, and that deeply embedded, I can't hear you and I can't understand you, you know, which diminishes and makes a mockery of somebody's language is you know, is a terrible thing. So I think we've got to grapple with language, and I think new language is desperately needed to get us out of those old pathways of the past. Dan, let's hear what you have to say about Ruth Miller.
Well, as David said, it's an enormously complex subject.
Yeah.
The way I tend to think of it is that all this is happening in mind, and mind is not separable from nature. Now, Ruth Miller, in her poem Mantis, which I mentioned, is certainly drawing on Bushman or abattoir beliefs in the spiritual figure or the trickster figure of the mantis, right? She's certainly got that in mind, but she's changing it in her own way. She was also embarked on a critique of the Christian God, whom she eventually rejected as being absent, if not non-existent. So I think what the poet does, and a lot of her poetry is very dreamlike, is in fact creating what we might call ontological assemblages. She's creating new languages, new ways of relating common things to one another, creating new, what feel to us like dreamlike portals, if you like, into new ways of thinking, which are ways of critiquing the old and the ways of creating new kinds of identity in an ever-changing world. And one can call those changes spirituality in some ways. You can call it Theriantropic if we're talking about animals. I think this takes us in a direction which really connects minds and interpretations, and we enter each other's consciousness, or enter the consciousness of animals, or even trees, which we heard about yesterday, in ways that are fundamentally poetic, and not just as some kind of decorative thing. These are ways of rethinking the world and rewording the world in ways that take us very, very deeply into linked consciousnesses. So I think of it as being in mind, just as a God figure might be in mind. Doesn't exist out there as a separable entity, doesn't exist only within as a psychological delusion. It exists as an assemblage in our connected intercommunication with the worlds around us. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, I think it helps us. I'm going to end the session because we need to have some tea and some walk. But I think what this session has done for us is told us that the spiritual is inescapably part of the terrain we've mapped out for ourselves when we start talking about the ecological. And then it strikes me very powerfully that this desire to be able to speak universally is deeply challenged by the fact that meanings are often very tied to the local. So, you know, that desire for a meaning that will speak, you know, to every human for all circumstances is to my mind, you know, deeply under attack, that actually we can't do that any longer, that we have to be very focused on the local and the understandings and the meanings that are built in particular kinds of places. So thank you all three for a very, very fascinating session. It's been interestingly, you know, these weavings have been very powerful and very extraordinary. So Dan, thank you. Ayanda, thank you. David, thank you. And let's go and get some tea.